Court agreed with our view on every count. I hope that the Scottish Government will in future work with us to ensure that their bills respect the devolution settlement so we do not waste any more time and money when enacting important legislation.
Mr. Speaker.
This government, Mr. Speaker, is committed to transitioning the economy to net zero by 2050. We recently published our net zero strategy, which will support hundreds of thousands of well-paid jobs and leverage up to £90 billion of private investment by 2030 across the entire UK.
Communities must be local as well as large-scale projects such as turbine manufacturing that Scotland's sadly missing out on. But local communities such as my own in East Lothian are denied a share of the wealth flowing ashore. There's a legislative gap to allow community benefit for onshore as opposed to offshore as opposed to onshore wind. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss this to see if East Lothian and other such communities can benefit from offshore wind as Shetland has benefited from oil and gas?
Well, I'm always happy to meet the honourable gentleman, but I would point out to him that this government is investing heavily in offshore wind, including announcements made this week by my right honourable friend.
David Dowd. Speaker, clearly Scotland has a lot to offer, not least in its high-quality wind. The net zero objectives. But can my honourable friend confirm that the ACORN, CCUS and hydrogen project is still very much part of the UK Government's plans for overall CCUS strategy and our objectives to meet net zero?
The short answer is yes. As I explained a moment ago, it wasn't successful to be in the first two, but it is a reserve project, and we are actively working to make sure it is there in future rounds.
Monaghan, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 97% of Scotland's electricity comes from renewable sources. Wow. This sector's expansion is hampered not by potential, but by the highest grid connection charges in the UK. COP is an opportunity to reassess such arrangements. So what discussions has he had with Cabinet colleagues on reducing these connection charges?
Well, I regularly meet Cabinet colleagues to discuss these matters and will continue to do so. What I would do is point out the investment my department is making in renewable energy right across Scotland, like the core renewable heat project in East Ayrshire, the tidal energy in offshore wind in Shetland. We are making real investment that will make a real difference to the people's lives and the planet.
Right. Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. And I start with Dr. Rupert Huck.
Number one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as the House will be in recess next week, I'm sure that colleagues will join me in looking ahead to Armistice Day and remembering those men and women who have served and lost their lives in the service of this country. We also thank the members of our armed forces who continue to do so today. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Rupert.
The Prime Minister's been busy preaching urgency this week at COP26. I hope he caught up with his sleep. But when he sits down with his grandchildren one day and they ask, what did you do that week of COP26? Would he be able to undertake one action in his gift that would have an immediate impact? Would he be consistent with what he's always said and done and take on the biggest emitter of CO2 in the whole of Europe that greedily, voraciously wants more? Will he ditch his predecessors' damaging, daft, pre-levelling up, pre-Zoom, pre-90% drop in demand and have a fresh vote in this House to kill off the third runway at Heathrow?
Mr. Speaker, what this government is going to do, rather than taking steps to damage the economy of this country, what we are going to do, which is what Labour would do, what we are going to do is get to net zero aviation, Mr. Speaker. That's the future for this country. Clean, green aviation. And by the way, I think that has every chance of arriving a lot earlier, Mr. Speaker, than a third runway at Heathrow.
James Wilde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share my right honourable friend's commitment to build back better, to build back greener and to level up. And I have a project that will deliver on all those things, rebuilding the ageing Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Kings Lynn. I've shown him the pictures of the 200 props holding up its decaying roof. So will the Prime Minister make the Queen Elizabeth one of the 8 new schemes giving people in Norfolk, Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire the hospital they need?
Mr. Speaker, I know that my honourable friend does a huge amount of work for his constituents. I have seen the pictures that he describes, and I can tell him that the application is in from the hospital in his constituency. It is under consideration, and we aim to make our final decision in the spring of next year.
We now come to the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I share the opening words from the Prime Minister regarding our armed forces and the tremendous work they do, and also send my best wishes to all those recovering in Salisbury, and give our sincere thanks to the emergency services that responded on that day. And I'd also like to wish all those celebrating tomorrow a happy and peaceful Diwali. Now let me start with something on which there should be agreement across all sides of the House. The independent standards process found that a member broke the rules on paid lobbying. Surely the Prime Minister accepts that this is and should be a serious offence. Yet we have seen reports that he will respond by scrapping the independent process and overturning its verdict. In no other profession in our country could someone be found guilty by an independent process and just have their mates vote them back into the job. Surely the Prime Minister and his government are not going to do that today.
No, Mr. Speaker, of course we're not going to do that, because paid lobbying, Mr. Speaker, paid advocacy in this House is wrong. And let me make absolutely no bones about that. And members who are found guilty of that should apologise and pay the necessary penalties, Mr. Speaker. But that is not the issue in this case or this vote that is before us today. It is not. The issue in this case, which involved a serious family tragedy, Mr. Speaker, is whether a member of this House had a fair opportunity to make representations in this case, or whether as a matter of natural justice, our procedures in this House allow for proper appeal, Mr. Speaker. And that I think is something that should be of interest to members across this House, Mr. Speaker, and should be approached properly in a spirit of moderation and compassion, Mr. Speaker.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, let me put this to him simply. If it was a police officer, a teacher, a doctor, we would expect the independent process to be followed and not changed after the verdict. It's one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. Mr. Speaker, when a Conservative member was found guilty of sexual harassment but let off on a loophole, they said the rules couldn't be changed after the event. So they can't change the rules to stop sexual harassment, but they can change the rules to allow cash for access. So why is the Prime Minister making it up as he goes along?
Mr. Speaker, all the professions that she mentions have a right of appeal, Mr. Speaker, and that is what the House needs to consider. And may I respectfully say to her that I believe that she needs to focus, instead of playing politics on this issue, which is what they are doing. I think that she needs to consider the procedures of this House in a spirit of fairness, Mr. Speaker. And we, on this side of the House, instead of playing politics, we are getting on with delivering on the people's priorities, Mr. Speaker. 40 more hospitals, 20,000 more police officers, wages up, growth up, and jobs up across this country. Those are our priorities.
Order. Mr. Perkins, I don't want to say any more of that either. Right. Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't about playing politics in this place. This is about playing by the rules. And as we can see, it's one rule for everybody else and one rule for the Tory Conservatives. When they break the rules, Mr. Speaker, they just remake the rules. And I know that Donald Trump is the Prime Minister's hero, but I say to the Prime Minister, in all seriousness, he should learn the lessons that if you keep cheating the public, it catches up with you in the end. Because while they're wallowing in sleaze, the rest of the country faces higher bills, rising costs and damaging tax rises. So I ask the Prime Minister, can you tell us what is the projected tax increase per household over the next 5 years?
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell her is that the recent budget did was take cash from those who can afford to pay the most, and it had very substantial tax cuts for the hardest working and poorest families in this country. We cut £1,000, Mr. Speaker, with the universal credit taper relief cut for hard-working families in this country. 2 million families had a £1,000 tax cut, and we're lifting the living wage across the whole country, Mr. Speaker. And what we are also doing, Mr. Speaker, is ensuring that this country gets on with a high-wage, high-skill, jobs-led recovery. And never let it be forgotten that if we listened to them, we would have none of those things, Mr. Speaker, because we'd still be in lockdown.
Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, I think he missed out the number, so let me help him out. The Resolution Foundation found that by 2026, taxes will be £3,000 more per household since he took office. My constituents and his constituents are feeling the pinch, and they're worried about Christmas as well, Mr. Speaker. Their bills are going up every week, and the budget did nothing to help them. So can the Prime Minister tell them how much was the tax cut that he gave to the banks instead?
Mr. Speaker, as she knows very well, it is the banks and the bankers who are paying far more proportionally as a result of our tax measures to cover the cost of the NHS. And actually, it's a very moot point, because the £36 billion came from 50% of it comes from the 14% who are the richest in this country, Mr. Speaker, overwhelmingly from the banks and financial services industry who can pay the most. And the astonishing thing, Mr. Speaker, is when it came to voting for that £36 billion increase in 48 new hospitals, in 50,000 more nurses, in looking after our public services, they voted against it, Mr. Speaker.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, according to the Prime Minister's own budget documents, it was £4 billion in tax cuts to the bankers and £3,000 of tax rises per household. Good news for the donors who gave his party £500,000. His bank got a bonus of nearly £8 million, but not so good news for the rest of us, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, this month, as the Prime Minister said, we remember and celebrate all those who serve our great country and all those who have lost their lives, leaving behind loved ones, and those who have sustained life-changing injuries and live every day with the consequences of their sacrifice. Yet hidden in the small print of the budget was a £1 billion cut to day-to-day defence spending.
Shocking.
So, Mr. Speaker, will our servicemen and women face pay cuts, or will there be fewer of them with less support?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's quite incredible that we're now hearing this from the Labour Party when they would have pulled us out of NATO and I think the right honourable lady actually wanted to abolish the army. What you've got, she wanted to abolish the army. The woman sitting next to her, Mr. Speaker. What you've got in this government is a spending on defence which is the highest since the Cold War, the biggest uplift since the Cold War, and an increase that has restored confidence in this country around the world in our ability to defend not just our own shores, but to defend our friends and partners as well. And that is what this government is doing.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, he knows that I asked him about the annual defence budget, which his own budget documents show will drop by £1.3 billion. Yep. And I hear the Prime Minister's fine words. I'm from a military family myself, but I won't take party political lectures from him because too often the government's actions don't match their words. Mr. Speaker, I think of my constituent who fought in Afghanistan and yet was threatened with sanctions because he was unable to physically travel miles to the nearest DWP office. Shameful. The Prime Minister's tax cut for short-haul flights last week cost £30 million. That is 50% more than the government spends on supporting veterans' mental health each year. The charity Combat Stress has lost £6 million in funding this year, even as their calls to their helpline have doubled. So will the Prime Minister match our proposal to reinvest the £35 million saved from cancelled MOD contracts to support our veterans that surely deserve it?
Mr. Speaker, it's because we've been able to run a strong economy and take our economy out of lockdown that we've been able to invest massively in the NHS. We've been able to lift spending on defence to record levels and to keep supporting our fantastic public services. That is what this government is able to do, Mr. Speaker. And I must say I enjoy my conversations with her in spite of the insults that the party political points that she directs it towards us, Mr. Speaker. And I may say, I don't want to cause any further dissension in the benches opposite, but I think you all agree she has about a gigawatt more energy, Mr. Speaker, than the right honourable gentleman, her friend from Holborn and St Patrick. I'm just putting it out there, but it's the same old Labour. No plan, no ideas. We're getting on, Mr. Speaker, with delivering on the people's priorities. We're taking this country forward. Growth up, jobs up, wages up, productivity up. All they do, Mr. Speaker, is play politics while we deliver.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister and the Government for securing our fantastic Stoke-on-Trent levelling up funding. And if we're to truly level up opportunities and access to opportunities in Stoke-on-Trent, we must also improve our poor public transport. So would my right honourable friend agree to look at the possibility for bus franchising in the potteries?
As my honourable friend knows, I'm a fanatic about buses. I will urge him to take up we're putting 1.2 billion more into bus funding, and I know that Stoke-on-Trent has applied. But can I suggest that he takes his suggestion up immediately with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport?
We come to SNP spokesperson in Blandford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I also, as we look forward to Remembrance Sunday, commend those that served and the military services that protect all of us, the security services, for the job that they continue to do. Mr. Speaker, Sir David Attenborough's powerful opening statement to COP26 told us that the journey to net zero means we must recapture billions of tonnes of carbon from the air. The Committee on Climate Change has been clear that carbon capture and storage is a necessity, not an option, to achieve the planet's net zero targets. This week, Scotland's world-leading climate targets have received widespread praise from, amongst others, the UN Secretary-General. Scotland is finding partners across the world to tackle the climate emergency. But in Westminster, there isn't even a willing partner to deliver the carbon capture project that was long promised. Scotland's North East has now been waiting weeks for a clear reason to exactly why the Scottish cluster bid was rejected. There have been no clear answers, not even clear excuses. So maybe the Prime Minister will answer the simple question: does he know exactly how much of the UK's CO2 storage the Scottish cluster could deliver?
Mr. Speaker, I'm a massive enthusiast for carbon capture and storage around the whole of the UK. The Acorn project in Aberdeen remains, as he knows, on the reserve list. He should not give up. We will come back to this, and of course, we want to make sure that we have a fantastic industry generating clean hydrogen around the country. He should not despair. In the meantime, we are supporting amazing Scottish plans to get clean energy from wind, from hydrogen, from all sorts of means, Mr. Speaker. And I may say, I want to thank the people of Scotland, and I want to thank the people of Glasgow for the way they helped to produce so far what I think has been a fantastically well-organised summit.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, it's bad enough that the Prime Minister rejected the Scottish cluster a week before COP. But what's worse, he clearly doesn't even know or understand what his government was rejecting. So let me tell him. The Scottish cluster bid would have stored 30% of the UK's CO2 emissions, and it would have supported the creation of around 20,000 jobs in green industries. It was by far and away the best bid, Prime Minister. If this decision was based on science alone, it would have been approved on the spot. It is obvious that this was a political decision in Westminster to reject it. With days left at the COP summit, will the Prime Minister now reverse his government's massive own goal when it rejected the Scottish cluster?
Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to encourage the right honourable gentleman to be a little bit less gloomy about the prospects of this initiative. I understand exactly what he says, and what we're doing is working with the Scottish Government, and I thank the Scottish Government for their cooperation, all the support they gave to COP as well in the last few days and weeks, and what they're doing. We will come back to this, Mr. Speaker. But what I may say is that I think what I think is working well is the spirit of cooperation between all levels of government in this country, and what doesn't work is confrontation.
Simon Jupp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House prices are rising in East Devon, with the dream of home ownership becoming out of reach for too many local people. New build developments must be affordable, with protections in place to restrict the number of properties becoming second homes. The loophole which allows second homeowners to avoid paying council tax should be closed quickly to help local authorities. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and colleagues from across the South West to discuss this growing crisis across our region?
Mr. Speaker, I know how strongly my honourable friend and other colleagues across the South West feel about this issue, and that's why we've legislated to introduce higher rates of stamp duty on second homes, and we will ensure that only genuine holiday businesses can access small business rate relief, Mr. Speaker, but I'm happy certainly to meet with colleagues to discuss what further we may do to ensure that local people get the homes they need.
Neil Hanby.
Speaker, Scotland is vital for the UK's energy needs, both currently and in the future. It's also vital for future offshore capabilities and other low carbon and renewable energies. Not my words, but those of the Minister for Energy, confirming that it is the rest of the UK that is dependent on Scotland, not the other way round. Does the Prime Minister not realise that his failure to invest in carbon capture and storage at St Ferguson, Grangemouth, and feeding the potential at Musmoran in my constituency is regarded as an act of deliberate economic vandalism, casting himself less as Bond and more as Blofeld the villain for all of the COP26 world to see?
Mr. Speaker, what the COP26 world can see is the astonishing achievements of Scotland and the rest of the UK in developing clean energy sources. And I've said to the right honourable gentleman, the leader of his party in Westminster, that we will come back to the Aberdeen. Sorry, forgive me, he's a member of a different party. Forgive me. Substantially the same agenda, though, Mr. Speaker. We will come back to this, and what I find encouraging about the last few days is the spirit of cooperation and joint enterprise that I now detect that will enable us to deliver massive carbon cuts across this whole country.
Peter Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Darlington Station is receiving £105 million thanks to this government's plans to make it HS2 ready. I want to make sure that Darlington benefits from high-speed rail. So will my right honourable friend meet with myself and regional colleagues to discuss the eastern leg of HS2 and reopening the Leamside line to allow the whole region to be better connected?
Well, my honourable friend, I thank him for everything he's doing for Darlington, and he should wait for the integrated rail plan to come out. But in the meantime, we are upgrading Darlington Station. There are plans in place, and my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, announced £310 million of funding over the next 5 years to transform local transport networks in the Tees Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister says he is a fanatic of buses, but what about trains, and not just in Darlington, but the mention of the Leamside line? Because last Wednesday I was notified that a joint bid to reinstate the mothballed Leamside line had not been successful in attracting the next stage of the feasibility funding from the government as part of the Restoring Your Railway Fund. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what specific plans does the government have to invest in the North East, in places like Gateshead and South Tyneside in my constituency, and when is he going to get serious about levelling up in our communities instead of just using the term as a meaningless populist slogan?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, she must wait for the integrated rail plan, but the North East will be the beneficiary of the biggest investment in our rail infrastructure beyond HS2 that we've seen for a century. About £96 billion more that we are going to be putting in, and what we want is we want the local authorities, we want the regional authorities to work with us to ensure that we promote the projects that the people really want.
Andrew Letts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you again. I want to really thank my right honourable friend for his support for the Early Years Healthy Development Review, and in particular for the £500 million of new money at Spending Review last week. My right honourable friend often says that talent is spread equally across our country, but opportunity is not. So does he agree with me that giving every baby the best start for life is the best possible way to level up across our country?
Yes, I thank, because I've listened to my right honourable friend over many years on this issue, and she is 100% right in what she says about the importance of early years, and that's why we're investing £500 million to support families and children, including £82 million to create a network of family hubs to bring together services for children of all ages. And we're going to continue, Mr. Speaker, to invest in children's early years. For example, the 15 hours of early education for disadvantaged 2-year-olds that's already benefited 1.1 million disadvantaged kids since 2013.
Session Lomi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was recently contacted by a Vauxhall constituent whose mother tragically committed suicide after criminal domestic abuse by her husband, with the inquest into her suicide finding his actions to be a direct cause. Incredibly, her abuser now stands to inherit her pension and entire estate because she was unable to complete divorce. This has left the family devastated, and I'm sure the whole House will join me in sending them our condolences. Yeah. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that convicted domestic abusers should never be able to profit from the crimes of their victims? And will he meet with my constituent and me to fix this hole in the law?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, she describes a truly tragic and appalling case, and I'm sure the whole House will share the revulsion that she's expressed at the outcome of the law's processes. I think we will certainly need to have a meeting in order to see what we can do to address this loophole.
Mr. Speaker, NHS staff performed magnificently in the pandemic, but there are now severe shortages in nearly every specialty. So will my right honourable friend support an amendment to the health bill backed by 50 NHS organisations, every Royal College, to require Health Education England to do regular independent forecasts of the numbers of doctors and nurses that we should be training, so that we can reassure people, despite the pressure today, we are at least training enough doctors and nurses for the future?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right that we've got to make sure our NHS has the staff that it needs, and that's why there are 50,000 more healthcare professionals in the NHS this year than there were last year. 12,000 more nurses, Mr. Speaker, and in addition, there are 60,000 nurses in training. And Mr. Speaker, somebody asked opposite, why are there waiting lists? Because we've been through a pandemic, Mr. Speaker. And what we're doing is fixing those waiting lists with £36 billion of investment, which that party opposite voted against, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a little over a year since I last challenged the Prime Minister over his campaign promises to the 1950s born women, in which time he has done hee-haw about their pension injustices. So can he tell me today, does his government have any plans to deliver justice for the women involved?
Mr. Speaker, this is a very difficult issue, as the whole House knows, and the case of the WASPy women is not easily addressed. As the honourable gentleman knows, the expenditure involved is very considerable, and the tax that would have to be raised would be very considerable. But we continue to reflect on all the options to ensure that people across this country get fair pensions.
Jill Morton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a mother, I cannot begin to imagine the pain and torment of losing a child. Richard Lee, a constituent of mine and veteran who served with distinction in the British Army, has been living with this pain every day of his life since the 28th of November 1981. On that day, his daughter Catrice Lee went missing from a military shopping complex near Paderborn in Germany. It was Catrice's second birthday, and her family are still searching. The 40th anniversary of Catrice's disappearance is coming up at the end of this month, which will undoubtedly be an exceptionally painful event for the entire Lee family. Would the Prime Minister please agree to meet with Mr. Lee, father to father, and reassure him that Catrice has not been forgotten?
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for raising this absolutely tragic case, and I know that the thoughts of the whole House will be with Catrice Lee's family. And of course, Mr. Speaker, I will agree to my honourable friend's request and meet Mr. Lee father to father.
So agree.
The Epilepsy Society is a charity and world-leading research centre based in my constituency. They've started the Epilepsy Climate Change Initiative to better understand the effects of global warming on epilepsy, and the impact is already clear. A recent survey showed that in hot weather, 62% of those whose seizures were uncontrolled experienced an increase in seizure frequency or severity. Will the Prime Minister join me in endorsing the Epilepsy Climate Change Initiative and commit to more funding to research the impact of climate change on human health?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. She raises a very interesting aspect of research into epilepsy. We're funding epilepsy research with another £54 million over the last few years, and this issue that she raises of any particular link between hot weather or climate change and epilepsy is certainly one that we will be going into.
Elliot Colburn.
Speaker, last week an independent inquiry into Lib Dem-run Sutton Council's own heat network found that it was set up on false assumptions, including funding that was never attained and homes that do not exist. And now my constituents are going to be left footing the bill. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this latest failure shows that they are just not fit to govern and that those responsible should go?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not the first time that the Lib Dems have campaigned on homes that don't exist or will never exist. If I think of their campaign in Chesham and Amersham, Mr. Speaker, but I will certainly look into the matter that he raises.
Bob Longfield.
Mr. Speaker, in a recent ITV interview, the Prime Minister was asked about my constituent, Jenny Garrett. Now, Jenny is a victim of the cladding scandal. Just before last Christmas, her building was evacuated because of safety concerns. She's been forced to pay £5,500 for awaiting watch and alarms. She has to find £1,200 a year for car parking she can no longer access. The work needed to make her building safe is being blocked by the actions of her freeholder. She doesn't know the cost she'll face, but it's estimated at thousands of pounds. Yet in his interview, the Prime Minister said Jenny had, quote, a frankly unnecessary sense of anxiety. So will he meet her to hear why she's worried and do so before the Building Safety Bill completes its passage through the House?
I'm afraid to say the honourable gentleman. I have every sympathy with his constituent, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly do. Mr. Speaker, I have every sympathy. I have every sympathy, but what I think is unfair is that people such as her are placed in a position of unnecessary anxiety about their homes when they should be reassured. And I think it is. I sympathise deeply with people who have to pay for waking watches and other such things. I think it is absurd. I think it is absurd, Mr. Speaker. But I think what people should be doing is making sure that we do not unnecessarily undermine the confidence of the market and of people in these homes, because they are not unsafe. Many millions of homes are not unsafe, and he should have the courage, Mr. Speaker, to say so.
I would. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands has chosen to cut back on stop and search across the region. Can the Prime Minister confirm that while stop and searches must be proportionate and not discriminatory, they remain an important part of keeping our streets and our communities safe?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I certainly agree with that, and it was a point that I raised recently with the Labour Mayor of London. We agreed on many things. He was very much out of line with the current Labour policy on lockdown, for instance. But he did certainly. I certainly thought that he was wrong about stop and search, and we need to make sure that stop and search is part of the armoury of police options when it comes to stopping knife crime. If it's done sensitively and in accordance with the law, I believe it can be extremely valuable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, we can save the UK taxpayer £200 million and level up South London's health service. St Helier Hospital is set to lose its A&E, maternity, intensive care, children's service, renal unit and 62% of beds to healthy, wealthy Belmont at a staggering cost of £600 million. But there is an alternative. Rebuild St Helier, where health is poorest, and save £200 million. Now, it's not my job to help the Prime Minister sort out his budget, but wouldn't this be a good place to start?
Mr. Speaker, we are investing in 48 new hospitals and rebuilds. And what is her job? What is her job, quite frankly, is to vote for £36 billion of investment in the NHS, which will allow us to take our health services forward. Why wouldn't she do that, Mr. Speaker?
Robert Jenrick. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister on his diplomatic efforts in recent weeks and ask him about another serious and grave issue that was raised at the G20 in Rome, the strong likelihood of a nuclear-ready Iran within a matter of weeks or months. What is the UK going to do with our international partners to tackle that? If it is via an agreement, will it be stronger and more enduring than the last one? And if it's not, as many people suspect, what is our plan B?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's in the overwhelming interests of and this is what thank you very much for his question. It's an issue he knows a great deal about. This is a case of making it clear to the Iranians that there is an opportunity for them to do something that I think would be massively in the interests of their people and of Iran, which is to come back to the table and do a further agreement, a son of JCPOA, restore the JCPOA at the Vienna talks. That is what needs to happen. That is the posture of the G20 and indeed of our friends and allies around the world.
Okay. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The universal credit cut is already hitting people hard. Even before the challenges of the pandemic, 39% of children in my constituency grew up in poverty. Now, Deptford First, a local charity I chair, has launched a fundraising campaign to support people through the winter months. The Prime Minister is well known for his abilities to attract wealthy donors to the party. Will he use those skills to boost our campaign? Or even better, will he cancel the cuts?
Mr. Speaker, what we've done with universal credit is abolish the old system that unfairly taxed people on universal credit and helped people with a £1 million tax cut, because what we on this side of the House believe in is rewarding work, Mr. Speaker. That's what the people of this country want to see. That's why we've put the tax cut on those who are on universal credit. That's why we're lifting the living wage, Mr. Speaker. And what's their policy on universal credit? No, it's not nothing. They want to abolish universal credit, Mr. Speaker.
Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Mayor of London is refusing to rule out the so-called Outer London charge, which would apply to all vehicles registered outside Greater London that cross the Greater London boundary. Now, this would have terrible consequences for my Orpington constituents, and indeed those people who live in the neighbouring constituency of Old Bexley and Sidcup. Now, Louis French, the excellent local candidate for the by-election, has pledged to fight this appalling proposal. Would my right honourable friend join me in wishing Louis French luck with this and to ensure that this silly move from the Mayor of London is stopped in its tracks?
I certainly do agree. I agree with my honourable friend, who is an old friend of mine. I've worked closely with him on London issues for many years, and I know where Labour's instincts are. They always want to put taxes up, particularly on motorists. And I think a checkpoint Chigwell would hit working families, Mr. Speaker. And what the Labour Mayor of London needs to do is get a grip on TfL's finances and stop whacking up the taxes on ordinary people in the capital city.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is very much aware of my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal, abducted by plainclothes officers while shopping with his new wife in the city of Jalandhar, Punjab on the 4th of November. The intervening years, Mr. Speaker, have seen allegations of torture overlooked and ostensibly strong words from his government about the case overshadowed by excitement over a trade deal with the Republic of India. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, as we approach the 4th anniversary of Jagtar's arrest tomorrow, with no charges having been brought in the case by the Government of India, would his government be able to grant the smallest of favours to Jagtar's wife and his family in Dumbarton and declare his detention an arbitrary one?
Mr. Speaker, I thank him for the campaign that he's been running for Jagtar Singh for a long time. And what I would say to him is that the closeness of our relationship with India in no way diminishes our willingness to raise that case with the government of India. And indeed, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, raised it only the last time she was in India.
Final question, Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the party opposite, I welcome the record investment in the NHS announced in the budget. Now, will my right honourable friend support my campaign for a new health centre in Rushcliffe, in the village of Eastleek, where the current building is no longer big enough to serve the current population, and they will soon need to accommodate 3,000 new patients from new buildings?
I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will do his utmost in the course of the coming decisions to oblige my friend in her campaign, justified campaign for Rushcliffe and its hospital. But, Mr. Speaker, how incredible that the Labour Party should continue to catcall and attack the government when they voted against the tax-rising measures that are necessary to fund our NHS. They are completely inconsistent, Mr. Speaker. They have absolutely no plans and no idea.
We now come to the statement. We now come to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'll make a statement about the G20 summit in Rome and update the House on COP26 in Glasgow. Almost 30 years ago, the world acknowledged the gathering danger of climate change and agreed to do what would have once been inconceivable and regulate the atmosphere of the planet itself by curbing greenhouse gas emissions. And one declaration succeeded another until, in Paris in 2015, we all agreed to seek to restrain the rise in world temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, after all the targets and the promises, and after yet more warnings from our scientists about the peril staring at us in the face, we come to the reckoning. This is the moment when we must turn words into action. If we fail, then Paris will have failed, and every summit going back to Rio de Janeiro in 1992 will have failed, because we will have allowed our shared aim of 1.5 degrees to escape our grasp. Even half a degree of extra warming would have tragic consequences. If global temperatures were to rise by 2 degrees, our scientists forecast that we will lose virtually all of the world's coral reefs. The Great Barrier Reef and countless other living marvels would dissolve into an ever warmer and ever more acidic ocean, returning the terrible verdict that human beings lacked the will to preserve the wonders of the natural world. And in the end, Mr. Speaker, it is a question of will. We have the technology to do what is necessary. All that remains in question is our resolve. The G20 summit convened by our Italian friends and COP26 partner last weekend provided encouraging evidence that the political will exists, which is vital for the simple reason that the G20 accounts for 80% of the world economy and 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. Britain was the first G20 nation to promise in law to wipe out our contribution to climate change by achieving net zero. And as recently as 2019, only one other member had made a comparable pledge. Today, 18 countries in the G20 have made specific commitments to achieve net zero, and in the Rome Declaration last Sunday, every member acknowledged, and I quote, the key relevance of achieving global net zero greenhouse gas emissions or carbon neutrality by or around mid-century. To that end, the G20, including China, agreed to stop financing new international unabated coal projects by the end of this year, a vital step towards consigning coal to history. And every member repeated their commitment to the Paris target of 1.5 degrees. In a spirit of cooperation, the summit reached other important agreements. The G20 will levy a minimum corporation tax rate of 15%, ensuring that multinational companies make a fair contribution wherever they operate. Over 130 countries and jurisdictions have now joined this arrangement, showing what we can achieve together when the will exists. The G20 adopted a target of vaccinating 70% of the world's population against COVID by the middle of next year, and the UK is on track to provide 100 million doses to this effort. By the end of this year, we will have donated over 30 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and at least another 20 million will follow next year, along with 20 million doses of the Janssen vaccine ordered by the government. And the G20 resolved to work together to ease supply chain disruptions which have affected every member as demand recovers and the world economy gets back on its feet. I pay tribute to Prime Minister Mario Draghi for his expert handling of the summit, but everyone will accept that far more needs to be done to spare humanity from catastrophic climate change. And in the meantime, global warming is already contributing to droughts and brushfires and hurricanes, summoning an awful vision of what lies ahead if we fail to act in the time that remains. So, the biggest summit that the United Kingdom has ever hosted is now underway in Glasgow, bringing together 120 world leaders with the aim of translating aspirations into action to keep the ambition of 1.5 degrees alive. I'm grateful to Glasgow City Council, to Police Scotland, to police across the whole of the UK, and to our public health bodies for making this occasion possible and all their hard work. For millions of people across the world, the outcome is literally a matter of life or death. For some island states in the Pacific and Caribbean, it is a question of national survival. The negotiations in Glasgow have almost 2 weeks to run, but we can take heart from what has been achieved so far. Nations which together comprise 90% of the world economy are now committed to net zero, up from 30% when the UK took over the reins of COP. Yesterday alone, the United States and over 100 other countries agreed to cut their emissions of methane, one of the most destructive greenhouse gases, by 30% by 2030. And 122 countries, with over 85% of the world's forests, agreed to end and reverse deforestation by the same deadline, backed by the greatest ever commitment of public funds to this cause, which I hope will trigger even more from the private sector. India has agreed to transform her energy system to derive half her power from renewable sources, keeping 1 billion tonnes of carbon out of the atmosphere. The UK has doubled our commitment to international climate finance to 11.6 billion, and we will contribute another £1 billion if the economy grows as is forecast. We've launched our Clean Green Initiative, which will help the developing world to build new infrastructure in an environmentally friendly way. And we will invest £3 billion of public money to unlock billions more from the private sector. The UK has asked the world for action on coal, cars, cash and trees. And we have begun to make progress, substantial, palpable progress on 3 out of the 4. But the negotiations in Glasgow have a long way to go, Mr. Speaker, and far more must be done. Whether we can summon the collective wisdom and will to save ourselves from an avoidable disaster still hangs in the balance. And we will press on with the hard work until the last hour. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of the statement and for updating the House on the G20 summit in Rome. It cannot be overstated how crucial the next week and a half is. I am pleased to see that there has been some progress, as the Prime Minister outlined, but the next 10 days needs to move beyond pre-packed announcements. This is an opportunity for Britain, Mr. Speaker, alongside our friends and allies around the world, to deliver historic change. By taking action to reduce emissions right now, in this decade, we can avoid the worst effects of climate change. This cannot just be a political ambition. It is necessity for humanity. So, Mr. Speaker, as the G20 ends and COP26 continues, I want to assure the Prime Minister everybody on these benches is desperate for COP26 to be a success. We hope that our negotiations can bring people together and deliver the urgent solutions to the biggest challenge our world has ever faced. However, Mr. Speaker, there is some cause for concern. The G20 needed to be a springboard to the COP26, a real opportunity to show Britain's diplomatic strength in bringing people together, but also in applying pressure where it's needed, to convince the big polluters to meet the commitments to 1.5 degrees and to find solutions to phase out fossil fuels, and to ensure a just transition for workers and to create a fairer and greener economy. But, Mr. Speaker, the G20 did not achieve this. No. The Prime Minister is failing in his efforts to convince the world leaders that more must be done. He has welcomed the commitments in the distant future, and I accept that, when he knows all too well that we need to halve the carbon emissions now, at least by the end of this decade, if we are to keep global temperatures down. It is a time for urgent climate action now, not more climate delay. Now, Mr. Speaker, we all know how difficult it is to convince the world to curtail carbon emissions, but it is our responsibility to do so. It is the Prime Minister's responsibility to influence world leaders and lead by example. But as we try to convince other countries to phase out coal, this government is refusing to make its mind up about coal mines within its own borders. They could have followed the lead of the Welsh Labour government and changed planning policy to make sure that no new coal mines had been developed, but they didn't. And as we try to convince big emitters to do more when it comes to reducing emissions, unfortunately this government are agreeing a trade deal with Australia that removes key climate pledges.
That's right.
It's undermining our messages by giving a free pass to our friends.
That's right.
And Mr. Speaker, when Britain must convince the wealthiest nations in the world to pledge more money to help developing countries cut their emissions and adapt to climate change, what's this government done? They cut development aid that would have funded vital climate projects. How does the Prime Minister expect to convince others to do more when he is setting such a poor example? Mr. Speaker, I also want to raise the issue of global vaccinations. The G20 last week agreed a vague promise to explore ways to accelerate global vaccination against COVID-19. Yet in some of the world's poorest countries, less than 3% of people have received even one dose of the vaccine. And we all know we live in a globalised world where more of the virus that spreads, the greater the threat of new variants. We are not safe here from COVID until people are safe from COVID everywhere. And there's no more time for rhetoric. It's time for action. And the Prime Minister mentioned our efforts on vaccines, but it was revealed last week that the UK is lagging behind all other G7 countries bar one in sharing surplus vaccines with poor countries. This, Mr. Speaker, is shameful. Our fantastic scientists that developed the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine are being let down by our Prime Minister's actions. We need booster jabs in Manchester and vaccines shared with Madagascar. It's now time for actions, Prime Minister, not words. So as the world gathers over the next 2 weeks, we all hope for a breakthrough that we need. Now, Britain has a proud history of building alliances and standing up for what's right, and I've no doubt that we'll be able to do it again. And I do wish the Prime Minister well in his efforts, and I ask him to pay attention and go for the detail on this, because if he fails to deliver, Mr. Speaker, if he fails to deliver the change that we need through this conference, we will all pay the price.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable lady asked me to go for the detail. Having said some kind things about her approach just now, I think after listening to that, I prefer the forensic approach, or the pseudo-forensic approach of the member for Holborn and St Patrick's. She's completely in ignorance of the basic facts, Mr. Speaker. We've cut our CO2 emissions by 44% on 1990 levels, very largely by moving from 80% dependence on coal 50 years ago to about 1 or 2% today. It is a massive cut. We haven't cut our investment in overseas development aid for climate change funding. No, we have not, Mr. Speaker. We've kept it at 11.6 billion. And then I don't know whether she was paying attention to the news, Mr. Speaker, but only the other day we announced another £1 billion, Mr. Speaker, which we're able to do because of the growth in the economy. And as for what she's completely wrong about the facts. As for what she said about vaccines, I'm afraid it is an insult to the incredible work that's been done by the UK vaccine rollout programme across the world. 1.5 billion people, Mr. Speaker, have had access to cost-price vaccines thanks to the deal that this government did with Oxford AstraZeneca, a record that no other country in the world has, to say nothing of the £548 million extra that we put into Gavi, or the extra 100 million vaccines that we're donating by June next year. This country has an absolutely outstanding record in supporting vaccination around the world, and if she wants to go and look at the detail, then I urge her to go off and study it. I welcome, Mr. Speaker, the broad thrust of what she was saying about COP26, because I think what she was saying there was that she sees signs of progress, but a lot more to do, which is, I think, I think, frankly, there she is right. If I could just point to the things that happened since G20, I would draw her attention to India's massive commitment to cut CO2 by 2030 by cleaning up their power system. I point to the £10 billion from Japan, to $10 billion from Japan over the next 5 years to support developing countries around the world. And I think I would also point to not just Brazil, but Russia and China and 110 countries around the world signing up to the Forestry Declaration to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. I think that's a very considerable achievement, and it will make a huge difference. And we will use consumer power and the power of corporations and the private sector around the world to effect that change. And the single most important thing for me that came out of COP was an agreement around the world about the basic intellectual approach now being taken by the UK through the Clean Green Initiative and what Joe Biden calls the Build Back Better World Initiative. And that is the thing that offers the greatest hope for humanity, because we're not just putting in government money to help countries around the world clean up and putting in development aid money, though we're massively supporting that. We're now leveraging in the trillions, the tens, perhaps hundreds of trillions of private sector investment. And that is the way to make the difference. And that is, if we can get that right at this COP, it will be a truly remarkable thing. But as I say, there is still a long way to go.
Sir Edward Lee.
Given that we are now taxing people at a higher rate than any time since we were impoverished under the Attlee government, and given that despite the fact we only produce 1% of global emissions and China produces 27%, and we are now loading further controls on our industry, which they are not matching in China or in India, further eroding our competitive advantage, will the Prime Minister grip all his spending departments and ensure that we root out waste and incompetence and create a genuine enterprise, low-tax economy?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we still have among the lowest corporation taxes in the OECD, in spite of the measures that we've been obliged to take because of the pandemic. And that's why we put in just, for instance, the 125% super deduction for companies to invest in capital, invest in infrastructure, and expand their businesses. And the results, the benefits are already being seen just in gigabit broadband alone, Mr. Speaker.
We now come to Ian Blackford, the Leader of the SNP.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, G20 was an opportunity to build momentum ahead of the COP summit, but I think even the Prime Minister will admit that the summit largely failed to meet the demand and desire of people for increased global cooperation. If we are to meet the global challenges that all of humanity now faces, that needs to change, and change very quickly, with a meaningful agreement in Glasgow over the course of the coming week. And all of us hope that that indeed will be the case. On climate change, we know that the G20 are responsible for 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it is right that it's the G10-20 members that bear the biggest responsibility. Yeah. Countries that have contributed the least to this climate crisis must not be left to pay the biggest price. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, there has to be a commitment to climate justice and why this is so important. In Scotland, we've recently doubled our climate justice fund to £6 million per year, providing £24 million over the Scottish Parliament session. But the commitments from the largest nations in the G20 always seem to be heavily caveated. On Monday, the Prime Minister promised £1 billion in UK aid for climate finance, but here's the catch: only if the UK economy grows as forecast. It's exactly the same excuse that is presented when it comes to the government's disgraceful policy of cuts to overseas aid. So, can I ask the Prime Minister, when will the UK government stop caveating its commitment to climate justice and follow Scotland's leadership and establish a climate justice fund? On Afghanistan, can I ask what concrete actions and timelines were agreed to help end the terrible famine that is ripping through that country? And finally, on COVID, what specific targets and timelines were agreed to rapidly increase vaccine rollout to those nations that are being left behind in the suppression of the virus?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, on the climate finance for the world, he's making a valid point, because it's absolutely essential that the developed world supports the developing world on the path to decarbonisation. But that's why the $100 billion per year is so important. And contributions such as the Japanese that we saw yesterday, what the French have done, what the Germans have done, what Joe Biden did the other day, these are important steps. But there is much more to be done. But be no doubt, he should be very proud of what the UK is committing. 11.6 billion that we said 2 years ago, plus another billion the day before yesterday. These are big sums now that the UK is giving. We are way out in front. On the his point about Afghanistan, and he's right to raise it. We had sad but good discussions about Afghanistan, and we're determined to work together to concert our humanitarian relief to do what we can, and notwithstanding the difficulties that there obviously are going to be with our relations with the Taliban. And on the global vaccine rollout, he'll have heard the commitments made by countries around the world, and I think the UK can be very proud of what we're doing on top of the 1.5 billion AstraZeneca, another 100 million doses by June next year.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
To what extent does the success of the entire enterprise depend upon the promised finance to the developing world?
Prime Minister.
Very largely.
Ed Davey. Sir Ed Davey.
Speaker, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for all his efforts to try to make COP26 a success. For many of us, halting climate change has been the passion of our lives. Can I ask the Prime Minister to confirm reports I've heard that the British negotiating team in Glasgow is seriously concerned that China's proposed contribution to cutting emissions, particularly on coal, goes nowhere near fast enough or far enough? And if that's the case, will he commit to working with all our partners in the West and across the world, particularly those vulnerable countries who are already watching the waves of climate change hit their shores, to take any necessary action to pressure China to make the right decision?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the right honourable gentleman, because if you look at his own political record, he's done a huge amount of good in this area, is the truth of the matter. I thank him for what he has done. And what is happening with China is very important, but it's a mixed picture. And it's important not to be too negative at present. Yes, he's right about domestic Chinese coal-fired production, and we're hoping for progress there. We're hoping that when China says that they can peak before 2030 in CO2 output, that date of before is correct, is considerably nearer now than 2030. So that's where the work is being done. But what is interesting is that when China made the commitment to stop the overseas financing for coal, that had an instant impact on many of China's friends and partners around the Asia-Pacific region, who took the signal and have also stopped overseas financing for coal. And I think it is that climate of the power of the room in the COP that is starting to make a difference. But whether it's going to be possible at this COP to get China to make the commitments that are really necessary, I'm afraid it is just too early to say.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome all the progress made so far at COP26 and congratulate all those involved, including my right honourable friend. But what will we do if we don't get agreement on Article 6 and persuade countries like China to properly price carbon into their economy? Our businesses in the UK are carrying their share of costs to deal with climate change. Why should we allow them to be undercut by competitors who keep their prices down by using highly polluting industrial production techniques? Surely this is not something that the free world economies could tolerate.
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend knows a great deal about this issue, and he's right to draw attention to Article 60 in the carbon credit issue, and that is something on which our negotiators will be working flat out until the final hour of COP.
Chris Bryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. One of the terrible effects of climate change is felt in South Wales Valley seats, where extreme weather conditions and heavy rain have destabilised some of the tips, the disused coal tips. People live in terror of another Aberfan, and I know the Prime Minister shares that fear. The majority of the dangerous tips are in my local authority area. I just wonder whether he'd be prepared to meet with myself, the leader of the local council, and the other members for Rhondda and Taff, specifically to discuss how we can make sure that all of these tips are safe. I really do ask him for that meeting.
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman. He's raised this issue with me several times. I will see what I can do to oblige him, and I know that this is it's something that I do want to try to fix, but it's primarily something that the Welsh government should be. It's primarily something that the Welsh government should be addressing themselves. I will talk to the Welsh government and come back to him.
Philip Hollowbone.
I strongly congratulate the Prime Minister on throwing his heart and soul at COP26. No one could have worked harder. The UK is responsible for 1% of global carbon emissions. China is responsible for 28%. Since 2000, two-thirds of the increase in global carbon emissions have come from China. Is China's commitment to reach peak coal in 2030 an aspiration or a binding target?
Prime Minister.
I think what President Xi Jinping would say is that China keeps its promises. We will have to hope that is true. I think that the people of the world will want to hold all of us, all governments, to account, but he is completely right to focus on the particular pressure that China faces from us and from the whole world.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's recent conversion to the climate cause, and I agree with him that the clock is indeed at 1 minute to midnight, which begs the question as why his snooze button was on for so long. But he'll know that the first rule of diplomacy is to walk the talk. So will he now take this opportunity to put real credibility behind his stirring words, to lead by example, and to commit now, finally, to reverse the decision on the Cambo oil field? Yes or no? Very simple.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the right honourable lady is that we continue to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels of all kinds, and we will be going for a complete net zero in our power production by 2035, moving beyond coal by 2024. And I think it was I read it was the Scottish National Party minister who said that oil was still a part of Scotland's future. I would say nothing about the Cambo oil field. What I will say is that there is a future for hydrocarbons insofar as you can liberate the hydrogen and make clean energy.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his leadership of COP, and particularly the achievement of getting 100 countries to sign up to the methane pledge. But he will know that some of the biggest emitters have not signed up to that. So when will the power of the room, which he described a moment ago, be on those countries to sign up to the pledge as well?
Prime Minister.
Now, Mr. Speaker, we're just going to keep going. And, you know, this is a rolling series of negotiations. We're ringing people up the whole time. The COP is in full flood at the moment.
Claire Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has not yet mentioned water resilience, and yet that is top of the agenda for many of the countries that are most affected by the climate emergency. Can he say what his assessment is of the funding for water resilience projects is, and commit not to cutting them, but to increasing funding for water resilience?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we support water resilience projects around the world as part of the FCDO, and had a good discussion on the issue of water and resilience and other aspects of climate change resilience with vulnerable countries over the last few days.
James Gray.
The Prime Minister knows very well that the north of Scotland is rather closer to the Arctic Circle than it is to London. And any delegate at COP26 who doubts the climate emergency, all they have to do is glance at the retreating ice or the melting permafrost or the methane being released as a result to be convinced that this emergency really is happening. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chinese will benefit particularly from the withdrawal of the ice as the northern sea route opens up, particularly for bulk carriers carrying coal. And will the Prime Minister not therefore agree with me that the Chinese have a doubly important moral obligation to stick by their commitment to reduce the production of coal in China? Otherwise, we in the West will be burning their coal.
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend is completely right to point out the consequences for the world of the retreat of the ice in towards the North Pole. It will not. Well, I'm afraid it will offer opportunities not just for China, but actually also for ourselves. And Scarpa Flow and other parts of Scotland will become potentially very important for sea traffic of a clean, green variety, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Unbelievable.
Prime Minister, in pursuit of the dramatic reductions in the minuscule CO2 emissions produced by this country, ordinary people are facing higher petrol prices, higher energy prices, restrictions on what they can drive, replacement of gas boilers, higher green taxes on their declining incomes. Can the Prime Minister understand their frustration and disdain that those who tell them they must bear these burdens fly into Glasgow in their private jets, ferry around the town in their gas-guzzling cavalcades, and more fundamentally, does he really believe that given the huge natural forces which have changed the world's climate continually, that somehow or by reducing CO2 we can turn the world's thermostat up and down at will?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, this country is moving to net zero or moving to zero-emission vehicles. He talks about gas guzzlers. We're supporting jet zero aviation, Mr. Speaker. And when he talks, his big objection is to the science, and he says that he's obviously a complete climate skeptic, Mr. Speaker. He should look at the graph showing, Madam Deputy Speaker. He should look at the graph. Showing the clear, which David Attenborough, Deputy Speaker, produced on the first day of the summit, showing the clear correlation between the huge anthropogenic spike in CO2 and the current rise in temperatures, and the way that temperatures track CO2 volumes in the air over the last thousands of years. The science is absolutely clear. And I think actually the people of this country know that the way forward for it will be an economic disaster not to address this. And what the people of this country know is that clean, green technology can deliver higher wages and fantastic jobs for generations to come. And they see a great future in this.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I really just want to reinforce the point the Prime Minister has just made, because I want him to reassure my constituents that the goal of achieving net zero is not a burden to be borne, but an opportunity to be grasped, to create new innovative jobs and new sectors in which we can lead the world.
Hear, hear.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our green industrial, Madam Deputy Speaker, our green industrial revolution alone generates the £26 billion that we're putting in generates 440,000 more jobs. Jobs in battery technology, jobs in EV manufacture, jobs in wind farms, jobs in maintenance. The opportunities are vast for this country, and we are at the cutting edge.
Jack Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the statement today, but does the Prime Minister believe, like I do, that it is important to encourage more people to use rail instead of other carbon-intensive transport methods? And if so, why is he cutting duty on domestic flights, or will he now rethink this decision?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there's a very clear climate reason for putting up duty on long haul, because that accounts for 96% of the emissions, and in the case of our own United Kingdom, with its far-flung islands represented by some distinguished members on the benches opposite, it is a useful thing to remove barriers to movement.
Bill Wiggin.
Given the phenomenal success to end and reverse deforestation, I was tempted to tease my right honourable friend about build back beavers. However, will he meet me to discuss what can be done using institutions like Kew Gardens to reverse the spread of deserts through better planting of trees?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and that's a brilliant idea. Kew has played an amazing midwife role over the centuries in taking plants from one part of the world, nurturing them, and then planting them with huge advantage in other parts of the world. And that is certainly something that I'd be happy to take up with him.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say to the Prime Minister, I think he's absolutely right that this is a moment for turning words into action. And one very important but quite small action that he and his government could take now would be the creation of a ring-fenced pot for the development of tidal stream energy in the next round of contract for difference auctions. This is a decision that has to be taken by the end of this month. Will the Prime Minister talk to his colleagues in Bees in the Treasury and make sure that it happens?
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a point that I've now heard several times from benches opposite, and I am myself, without having all the technical expertise, I am very impressed by the tidal proposals that I have seen. What I will undertake to the right honourable gentleman is not to make an absolute commitment on the contract for difference or the strike price for tidal power, but I will certainly go away and look at it again.
Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well done, Prime Minister, in motivating people and for delivering that which others were saying couldn't be delivered at COP26 so far. Just a couple of days in, actually, to a 2 weeks programme. But can I invite my right honourable friend to visit Rolls-Royce, who are working on developing a 100% sustainable fuel jet engine for aviation,